Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of El Niño Speaks. And today we're going to take a more interesting turn into historical revisionism. And I've brought back on Thomas 77. And we wanted for today, Thomas, discuss the legacy of Harry Elmer Barnes, who I believe is a fascinating figure. But before we start talking about this, give the audience, especially those who are not acquainted with your work, a brief overview of what you do, and then we can just go head in.
I mean, first and foremost, I'm a revisionist writer. I've been at this. I'm getting pretty old, so I've been
Yeah.
at this since about 1992. And in those days, obviously, you were limited to what you could find at your public library system, as well as print publications, such as the Journal of Historical Review, which was great, and Institute for Historical Review was the parent institution of that publication, and they've made the transition to digital media splendidly. And I know you'd agree with that assessment, but I my primary research concentrations is 20th century, a strong emphasis on Third Reich and World War II, but also Cold War. I think of myself as a political theorist, and a right Hegelian. Um, I've got concomitant with that is I write a lot on continental philosophy, and political theory. I write some about macroeconomics. I also write science fiction. I think of myself as kind of like overall like somebody who comments on zeitgeist matters. Okay, and obviously I'm also Harlequin and something of a court jester, and I'm fine with that. Because clowns are fucking awesome. Like anybody who says they're scary or that they suck is a lame. But so I wear like many different hats, and some of those hats are kind of silly, but some of them are profoundly serious, and I'm at peace with that. I kind of gotta be because I'm too old to make a fundamental change in how I move and do things, and I can't sing or dance, and I'm not particularly handsome, so I kind of got to stick with this. That's what I do.
All right. We're going to be talking a lot about revisionism throughout this conversation, and I think that any serious discussion about historical revisionism, it seems that it starts and ends with Harry Elmer Barnes. Could you just go ahead and give like the brief overview of like the biography of Harry Elmer Barnes and why he's so important?
Yeah, sorry
Thomas?
for the delay.
Yeah.
Yeah, briefly, but yeah, briefly. I mean, Barnes was kind of the first. He was kind of the first revisionist, capital R, in the sense that we conceptualize it. And for context, he was not a fringe figure. He wrote for Foreign Affairs, which is a still active academic journal. It was and is the journal for the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm not a fan of that institution, but they have a lot of clout to this day, although it's diminished. But in the early 20th century, they were viewed as the authoritative, kind of journal of by and for public intellectuals on the subject of international relations and high politics. Okay, so he was not this kind of fringe figure who was was being tapped by the Kaiserreich or something to write propaganda copy. Nor was he, some guy who had some sort of axe to grind with Jews or something. So he started kind of dressing up these passions in a historiographical veneer. That wasn't the case at all. And to be clear, I'm getting a little bit ahead, but I think it's material to address it now. Barnes became fairly well acquainted with Kaiser Wilhelm II after World War I. He went so far as to visit him in the Netherlands, where Wilhelm was living in kind of genteel poverty in exile. And, he and Barnes did not really see eye to eye. Barnes's notion on World War I was that it was basically a conspiracy of I don't mean that in punitive terms. I mean, he was speaking of secret diplomacy and legerdemain and bad faith, duplicity from Paris and Moscow. He basically viewed World War I as kind of a conspiracy of the French and the then actively failing Russian Empire, to destroy and then cannibalize the nascent German Empire. When I say nascent, I mean Germany is obviously an ancient culture, but as a consolidated state, that was becoming the dominant industrial and military power on the continent. That's why I invoke that particular descriptor. But Wilhelm did not accept this at all, and like Wilhelm was not only was he related to the last Tsar, as both were related to King George. Wilhelm viewed he viewed in his view, quote, Jews and Freemasons being kind of the primary architects of the war, despite the kind of savagery of the Russo-German War. And I mean, let's be honest, a Teutonic Serbian Rassenkrieg basically touched off the conflagration. I mean, that's painting in very broad strokes, but I think the listeners understand what I mean. There's no love lost between Russians and German people. Okay, and in the eyes of many Habsburg Germans, the Russians. My point being, despite that kind of brutal reality, Wilhelm, he had an oddly kind of charitable view of the Russians. But there was kind of a peculiar disconnect between the view from the House Hohenzollern and the kind of German street, as well as kind of the reality of power politics, as certain enmities, ancient as they may have been, were developing a peculiar intensity in the first decades of the 20th century. But my point being, like, Barnes wasn't this kind of stereotypical American right winger who was kind of trying to cast his own ideological prejudices onto the historical record. And to be clear too, World War I was a tremendously unpopular war, and in the aftermath, especially the disaster that was Versailles, the American people they felt they'd been duped, and they felt that close to 100,000 young men in the prime of their life had been snuffed out really for no reason, which came, a decade and a half subsequent, that really that wasn't Nye and his coterie trying to mine for clout or something. People were outraged. It was like public demand that led to a kind of ethical and material auditing of what exactly happened here. And people forget that Wilson quite literally got elected on a promise to keep America out of war. And even when the Lusitania went down, it was almost it was years before America entered the war in formal capacities.
Hey, Thomas, real quick.
So this idea that
your sound is very spotty at times, and it like robots and stuff. I've noticed this throughout the interview. Not sure if you could fix it or something like that, or there's some connection issue.
Yeah, I've been having issues with StreamYard, man. Like, is that any better? Like, is my audio any better now or no?
Yeah.
Okay, it's good now. Okay, yeah. All right, yeah. I'm sorry about that. It's still good. It's still coming through. Okay.
Yeah, it's coming through. Yeah, but continue with your last thought.
Oh well, it's yeah, the Nye committee Wilson was elected quite literally on a promise to keep America out of war. Okay, and when the war arrived, it became clear to people. World War I was a rare instance of high finance very much having a dispositive stake, not just in the conflict and the ultimate outcome, but also wielding the power to sway executive decisionism in their favor. Okay, and this it's almost never the case that quote unquote bankers are going to sue for war. Well, in World War I on the American front, that actually happened. Okay, and what did America get out of World War One? I mean, and nothing. So I mean, Barnes was very much leading the charge of kind of auditing on the political side what actually happened, how this constellation of factors coalesced to make the war possible, how so many otherwise reasoned men were kind of deluded into going along with this. So that's the context, and it really wasn't until the New Deal revolution, and even before the onset of formal hostilities, and even before Lend-Lease and the Atlantic Charter, when censorious and antics by the New Dealers really ramped up in earnest, and before Roosevelt had kind of weaponized the Department of Justice, to
Hey, you fell off, man.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I had to unplug my external mic because that might be sucking power. No, StreamYard has been horrible lately on my. I'm moving forward. We might have to utilize a different platform. But all right, let me regain my train of thought. But even before Roosevelt and the New Dealers really kind of weaponized the Department of Justice to prosecute and incarcerate, in some cases, people they viewed as being insufficiently enthusiastic about the regime's disposition towards the Third Reich. Barnes was being kind of slated for a campaign of libelous disinformation and things of this sort. Okay, and that also, so not only was Barnes kind of the first revisionist in the sense we understand it, colloquially and in terms of as an academic discipline. But he was kind of like the first case of literally a historical writer being singled out and antagonized and being cast as this kind of quasi-criminal character on grounds of things that he wrote about the historical record and, historical phenomena that he related to the then present to, issue forth critiques of then extant policy. Like, I can't really emphasize how strange this is. Like a government taking historians and public intellectual types and casting them as dangerous, subversive people. I mean, on some terms, that's just really strange. Okay, so that was Barnes' deal early on. His big his kind of seminal text in the interwar years was the Genesis of the Great War, and that's, like I said, that's an unusual book. It kind of reminds me of A.J.P. Taylor's book that was written decades later on the Second World War. It's a novel hypothesis. Like I said, it's heterodox within revisionism. But it's well worth reading, and it's even if I part ways with the kind of epistemic priors that Barnes brought to the table in formulating his kind of theory of the conflict. The Barnes really, what kind of really I think sealed his fate as being treated as a formal opponent of the New Dealers. The British diplomat and the kind of crazed Germanophobe Sir Vansittart, Robert Vansittart, Barnes published an article that basically outlined, that Vansittart's, like, basically who was funding him, what his kind of core motives were, in this kind of endless agitation and disinformation and propaganda campaign contra the Third Reich. And Barnes pointed out that the Anti-Defamation League was working very closely with Vansittart as well as the Board of Jewish Deputies, and that combined with Vansittart's aristocratic connections and things, he was able to intimidate his opponents into submission. And in America, this was very much being duplicated, albeit with somewhat of a different, aspect owing to the, sociological and cultural variables. But Vansittart famously sued Barnes for libel, and made a big deal about, Barnes is just an anti-Semite, and he sympathizes with the Third Reich, and he's colluding with them. I mean, this kind of dummy Zionist garbage. This is a very, very, very old playbook. It's basically extrapolate the kind of quite literally retarded nonsense that these people like levy at their enemies these days, and that's what they did. That's what they did to Barnes. He was kind of he was very much kind of like David Irving 1.0. But that's that's basically. And then I'll wrap it up and give it back to you in a second. But he after World War II, he was something of a mentor to David Hagen. And David Hagen was another seminal revisionist. And Hagen specifically, one of the things that, Hagen was pretty prolific, but he translated a lot of these documents between the Polish diplomatic mission in Washington, like back to their foreign office or their foreign ministry in Warsaw, and their kind of discussions about like their impressions of the New Deal regime being kind of like this rabidly anti-fascist cadre and very Jewish in character, quite literally. And also like the sheer recklessness and kind of instability and irrational decision making characteristic of the Polish junta as well. And like a lot of Americans didn't know about this at the time, and it's not like they had the internet or something. Obviously, I mean, I realize I'm being obtuse, but it, and Hagen's his I mean the early '60s, like think that what we think of as the Kennedy era in America, there was a lot of interesting like discursive activity, particularly in academic among academic historians, and Hagen was kind of part of that milieu, and Barnes was very respected in those circles, obviously, and the as and despite the kind of comparative prestige that this kind of burgeoning historical school of thought came to enjoy, it was very purposely marginalized, so Barnes kind of became synonymous in the public consciousness owing to like a dedicated campaign against him as the quote anti-Semitic historian. I mean that's kind of the short answer. He wrote he ended up writing a lot. He contributed a lot to the American Mercury, which was an interesting publication. It had different kind of incarnations throughout the decades. Early on, it had like H.L. Mencken, everyone's been at the helm, if memory serves. Yeah,
that's who I always associate it with. Yeah,
and then this final run, you had some like open like National Socialist type guys who contributed to it. H. Key Thompson contributed to it intermittently, but I mean that's basically Barnes's intellectual heritage, if you will. So yeah, he's I realized I was like long-winded. For give me if that.
No, I thought it was super informative. One question, because I am always interested in knowing how some of these figures interacted with contemporaries and similar peers. Do you have any evidence of Barnes mingling with the likes of Father Coughlin, John T. Flynn, or Charles Lindbergh at that time? Because it seems that he would have a lot of overlap with their views.
Lindbergh, I'm almost certain he wouldn't have. I mean, Lindbergh was very careful about the company he kept. And there's the I think most people probably view it as not at all credible, but like the subjects that ridiculous Philip Roth novel, The Plot Against America. I mean, it's typical kind of Zionist, ethno-sectarian, like ridiculous, like chauvinistic paranoia. But like the subtext of that, or the kind of the plot device of that novel is that Lindbergh becomes president. I think that was very possible. Okay, and FDR certainly thought it was possible. Like FDR viewed the biggest threat to, his kind of ideological vision as Huey Long, and after Huey Long was murdered, Lindbergh was kind of like a natural. He was kind of like a natural figurehead for the old right, which was remarkably cohesive in those days, and it had been, the post-bellum years in the North, when a truly kind of national economics was being realized, and the architecture of it, was kind of finally coming to full fruition. There very much was this kind of like America First. It wasn't just like a slogan, and it wasn't like today where it's kind of just like this like loosely defined, if well placed. I mean, don't get me wrong, objection to globalism. Like in those days, it there was some very deep kind of cultural variables that went into it, and a discrete kind of self-conscious understanding among the people who kind of adhered to that branding. But so my point being, like, I don't think it's not fantasy or some goofy science fiction to suggest that Lindbergh could have been president. And regardless, he definitely had political ambitions. Okay, I can't see him associating personally with Barnes just because it would have brought baggage that without a lot of benefit. Coughlin, probably, yeah. And there was an avid correspondence between figures on the right. That's one of the things that's so interesting about the 1944 sedition trial. I mean, which was laughable, and there's nothing funny about it. These people had their lives ruined, but they were all acquitted. But one of the ways that the prosecution, one of the things that motivated them to craft the indictment as they did, it's basically like this constellation of like in coat relationships, but like very, very diverse elements on the right and in America First had kind of come together, even if it was just a fairly avid correspondence. So yeah, I'm sure that Barnes crossed paths with Coughlin, if only by trading letters and things.
Would you say that the quote unquote proto cancellation of Barnes started after World War II, or was it during the New Deal period that he began to fall out of favor with like respectable society?
Oh, it's definitely during. I mean, part of the New Deal regime, it was a social engineering regime, from the top down, and its guiding ideological imperative was anti-fascism. Okay, so from the moment Roosevelt took the oath of office, like the New Deal regime was colluding with communists and Zionists, and it was doing everything it could to destabilize the German Reich and attack it by proxy. America had been the New Dealers had been at war with the German Reich for years by December 1941, but from jump as well, they were trying to suss out and ruin, punish, discredit, and otherwise terrorize anybody they viewed as having fascist sympathies or like quote unquote isolationist sympathies. So this began as soon as the New Dealers took office. But it's also too, Barnes, he had a target on his back because again, the Nye Committee was emergent owing to like literally popular demand. This was a very organic phenomenon. But there's some very powerful people, who for some of them, shared values and political interests in common with the New Dealers, but some of them didn't. But they were not happy about being exposed by Barnes. They were not happy. And in those days, like, people hated Wall Street. People think it's bad now where some idiot kid can, goes out and murders some insurance executive. People are like, oh, it's, people hate capitalism these days. It's like, man, like, that's nothing compared to a century ago. Yeah. I mean, this because you're a learned guy, but you had Barnes going around basically exposing, J.P. Morgan and these arms industry types, who had senators and congressmen in their pocket, some of whom sat on not just appropriations committees, but but who sat in committee that had real power to sway foreign policy. I mean, this was a bad thing for them, So Barnes was kind of coming under fire from all sides, and proverbially speaking, some direct fire, some indirect. But yeah, it began really, as early as 1934, 35, 36. Yeah.
One of the more remarkable facets of Barnes's work, from what I've been able to skim through more or less, is his history on the lead up to World War II, especially in the German and Japanese theaters. And based on your analysis of like Barnes's work, what struck out to you as some of like the most like poignant observations he made about how the New Dealers tried to get the US involved in World War II like at all costs?
Well, interestingly, Mearsheimer, directly or indirectly, I absolutely guarantee Mearsheimer read Barnes. I mean, Mearsheimer's an
Yeah,
old
John
guy.
Mearsheimer. Yep.
Yeah. He's my dad's age, and so I mean, when he was a young man, I'm sure he read Barnes's stuff. But Mearsheimer, in the tragedy of great power politics, Mearsheimer's take on the strategic and political situatedness of the Japanese Empire is basically what Barnes's analysis concluded, and that being that out of all the major combatants, out of all the states that became major combatant states in World War II, like Japan was the most precariously situated, and Japan inarguably had no choice but to sue for war. And Barnes made that point very effectively, and in those days too, there was a kind of monumental ignorance on the subject, especially in Japan. Like this idea that the Japs are crazy, they follow an emperor and are kamikazes who do crazy things, and one day, for no reason, because they're just irredentist crazy people, they attacked Pearl Harbor. I mean, that's laughable. Like, even a child would realize that that's utterly moronic. But people accepted this kind of garbage, like way more, in my opinion, than they did some of the claims about the German Reich. And some of that owed to military realities and the Cold War and the need to not totally vilify the Reich. I mean, obviously that it when that changed later, but I think that's a key observation, and also the degree to which and Irving's accounts have been different, and I'm talking I'm speaking in terms of causal variables and what he emphasizes, but this Polish military junta, it was kind of like the criminal regime in Kiev of today. It was this crazy military junta. It was ethnically cleansing Germans, Russians, Ruthenians, Jews, anybody else they didn't like. It was a kleptocracy. It was totally unstable. It was basically this attack dog that the United Kingdom decided to set loose to destabilize the strategic balance, and then declare that they had some airtight, in moral terms, casus belli, because the German Reich is assaulting like noble Poland. I mean, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But Barnes, he, like I said, he really made a lot of the corruption of the Polish government, its naked irrationality, and most significantly, even this military junta that was basically getting everything it wanted, from the Anglos and the Americans. They were taken aback and disconcerted. Their diplomatic delegation at Washington, they're like, basically, this is a bunch of Jews and crazy anti-fascists, and they're trying to provoke a war with Germany. and this is going to be a game changer. Like the Poles thought that with like a British war guarantee, they could sue for war and basically capture East Prussia and some of these other and some of these other some of these other Central European territories that had long been a subject of a grievance with what had been the Habsburg Empire and then the German Reich. But they thought that what the New Dealers were trying to do was crazy, and it was. But again, this kind of stuff wasn't widely available unless you were somebody who had linguistic fluency or you were willing to kind of pour over. I guess it would have been like microfilm in those days. And even that was probably pretty rare in terms of research libraries that had that kind of technology available. But unless you're willing to kind of like sit, pour a microfilm and original documents or carbon copied documents with a Polish to English or German to English or dictionary, like you weren't going to be able to develop a meaningful conceptual picture of these things. So that just off the top of my head, that's what stands out to me.
Yeah. What I noticed about Barnes's life towards the end, like he died at the height of the Vietnam War, if I'm not mistaken, around like 67 or 68. And
that sounds right.
Yes. Was like in his later years, in which I imagine he was just thoroughly purged off like the record, or at least not so much purged from CFR Foreign Affairs, but I imagine he was not even like allowed to like submit anything there, much less get published there. What was he up to at that time? Was he interacting with other revisionists, trying to form his like own institutions to make sure that this knowledge will be imparted to future generations?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, especially during the early 60s. And again, like I think I just indicated, there was kind of a brief period where heterodox kind of historical theories had gained kind of traction as well as respectability. And he, Barnes, despite the kind of, I'm not resorting to hyperbole when I say there were some pretty monumental efforts against him in preceding 25, 30 years. But around 1962, 63, he found some allies in the American Historical Review, I think it was called. It would the branding of which was somewhat misleading. I believe that it was actually a kind of coterie of public intellectuals based out of Oxford, and they were writing about American politics specifically, and even more, kind of narrowly, they were focused on like American presidential politics and kind of like war and peace matters. Okay, and they took an interest in Barnes's work product, particularly this kind of like critical stuff that he'd written about, Wilson and Colonel House and kind of the constellation of factions around the Wilson White House. A few years later, he was one, I think, his first openly his first open Holocaust revisionism appeared a few years later. I don't like that term Holocaust, but just colloquially, so people understand what I'm talking about, so I'm invoking it to be clear. The article was called, quote, Zionist fraud, or the Zionist fraud. And I think it either first appeared in the Liberty Lobby magazine or newspaper, which in those days was the Spotlight. The Spotlight was the Liberty Lobby rag before American Free Press, which is a great publication, I might add. But like to this day, like I still get it at the newsstand. Yes, we still have a newsstand or two in Chicago, and yeah, there still is a paper edition of AFP, and I'm old, so I still buy it and read it. But it was it also ran in American Mercury, but I can't remember where it originally appeared. But that was essentially, you know, the basic like gist of it was like, look, you know, like you're like, yeah, European Jewry, like all combatant populations, World War II, like, you know, suffered serious attrition, and there are some very inhuman barbarisms that occurred, especially in Poland and you know, and the Ostfront. But he's like, this, you know, most of what was alleged at Nuremberg is a lie, or you know, this evidence was never authenticated. You know, the standard of review was laughable. You know, there's a very aggressive and dedicated cadre of people, you know, who are very, very committed to presenting the Jewish experience of World War II, not just as central, but as this kind of fantasy narrative of martyrdom, you know, and, you know, in the present, this privileges, you know, like Jewish interests over those of less mobilized and less powerful groupings, you know, I mean, which is all true, you know, and in those days, there wasn't nearly the bully pulpit enjoyed by, you know, politically mobilized Jewish interests that there was, you know, like in the 70s, 80s, and especially the 90s, which in my opinion it peaked. But it was still it was still a very powerful faction, man. You know, so when Barnes started producing copy like that, you know, that's when really he kind of brought the wrath of Jewish NGOs and their allies in, you know, in the kind of deep state permanent regime and things like down on him, and that's when he truly became kind of he kind of like excluded for all time from polite academe, you know, because it's the litmus test until very recently. You know, the litmus test was you just cannot like any criticism of Jews as like a political actor or as a mobilized you know, political and sociological quantity. Like any discussion of that, you know, is itself questionable. You know, casting any kind of punitive aspersions on that phenomenon and those agents and actors, you know, that's anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is this insidious thing that, you know, if permitted and if cultivated by its proponents, it leads to mass homicide and all these depravities. And, you know, if you hold these opinions, you're essentially the same as the fascists, and the fascists were the most evil people who ever lived. You know, I mean, all this. I mean, this is obviously like a religion, okay? And like literally, it's, you know, like a theological commitment, okay? I mean, to anybody who's at all thoughtful on these matters, or is it the simpleton? But it was the degree to which this kind of conceptual bias in favor of kind of the secular religion of Zionism and Jewish martyrdom, like the degree to which that was like absolute and basically insurmountable in public discursive spaces, and until like very recently, like that can't be overstated.
To wrap things up before we depart, what institutions and individuals, in your view, are carrying out the legacy of Harry Elmer Barnes and continuing revisionist work that challenges many of the commonly accepted narratives of 20th century history, or just history in general, too?
I mean, I've got my own list of historians who I think were and are absolutely essential to understanding real history. You know, I could tick those off if you wanted me to. If you're asking me about in the present day,
Yes,
the
present
Institute
day.
for say again.
Yeah, present day.
Yeah, the Institute for Historical Review, which is still around and still very active, they are great, and they're doing God's work. And I can't praise them enough. You know, they've got great people involved with them, and very dedicated people. You know, their scholarship is impeccable. The standards that they hold their contributors to is constantly professional. E. Michael Jones isn't a revisionist in the conventional sense, but he does write on historical subjects, and he's really developed quite a following online. And his book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, that's a tremendous book. Okay, and I'm very much a reformed Protestant. You know, I'm not. I mean, I've got a lot of respect for the Catholic tradition. It's wonderful, but I mean, it's not my culture. So I mean, so just to be clear, like I part ways with Jones on a lot of his faith based views and commitments. But the book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, that's essential in my opinion to understanding, you know, kind of the dilemma in the modern age, especially between our people and Jewry, and the kind of tragic outcomes in the modern age between European Jewry and their host societies. He died about 10 years ago, but Russell Stofley, he wrote a book, Hitler Beyond Evil and Tyranny. I realize like a dead man can't be contemporary, but he'd written a lot on conventional force structure in the 80s, contra Warsaw Pact, like fascinating and important stuff. You know, that's a bit outside the scope, but just a few years before he died, I think it dropped in 2012. His Hitler biography is very much inspired by, not influenced, let's say, influenced by Carlyle. You know, he discussed Hitler as a messianic personage, you know, in the vein of Cromwell and Muhammad, and that's true. But there's you know, like I said, American Free Press, Liberty Lobby, Institute for Historical Review, they do great stuff. And just you know, a bunch of the younger guys, man, like in our community and in our various cadres, man, like who, you know, who are content creators like I am, you know, and you are, who have you know, and they just bring a lot of a lot of energy to the table, and they've got good research habits, and they're just doing God's work, man. I mean, that's the best answer I can give. Just shooting from the hip.
Great stuff, Thomas. Overall, I found this discussion to be very fruitful, and I think it will open up more doors for this new series of revisionism we're going to delve into, because I believe that the record of the 20th century needs to be corrected, and we both of us will do a great job in doing this.
No, this was great, man. Thanks for hosting me. It's always an honor, and always great to talk to you, man. And I always learn stuff from these conversations we have. But yeah, moving forward, man, like as we get into our regular collaboration, I'm very excited, man. Yeah, there's a lot here, and there's very much been a profound shift in the zeitgeist. I was talking to Jay Burden about that like a couple hours before we convened. And yeah, it's these are very exciting times, man. And yeah, I'm tremendously stoked. And yeah, I apologize again for the hardware issues on my end.
It's all good, man.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, and yeah, we'll reconvene. We'll reconvene in a week or two, man, and we'll continue doing what we're doing.
Awesome, man. To the audience, again, thank you so much for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken. All right.